Welcome to this virtual parallel event of the 45th session of the Human Rights Council meeting held this week at the Palais des Nations, the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. This event is under the auspices of Incomendios, an NGO in consultative status with the ECOSOC. It is also co-sponsored by the Koani Foundation in Hawaii, as well as the Peace for Okinawa Coalition. My name is Lyla Berg, and I am speaking to you from Hawaii. I'm a former public school teacher and principal, and a former state legislator in the Hawaii House of Representatives. I will be moderator for this panel. Today's topic is demilitarizing the Pacific, Hawaii, Okinawa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas Islands. The United States has long held an extensive military presence in the Pacific, particularly on islands such as Hawaii, Okinawa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. The native peoples of these islands have long opposed the presence of the military and have demanded a significant reduction of military imposition on their lands. The United States attempts to placate these demands by moving large numbers of military personnel from one island to another. Recently, the United States and Japan decided that they would move 1/3 of Okinawa's military presence to Guam. Now the native peoples of these islands have joined together to outright condemn the transfer of military personnel to and from various islands, and to call for the complete removal of military forces from the Pacific. Joining us today as panelists are His Excellency Leon Kaulahao Siu of Hawaii, Mr. Robert Kajiwara of Okinawa, and Congresswoman Sheila Babauta of the Northern Marianas. Our panelists are influential representatives from their respective locations and will be discussing the impact of the military on their respective islands. Our first speaker is His Excellency Leon Kaulahao Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Hawaiian Kingdom and prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. Minister Siu is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore and develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated in 2017 for the Nobel Peace Prize. Aloha, Minister Siu. The floor is yours.
Aloha, aloha ia mai o koa e maluhia hoi ke akua, e ko ka ko makua e ka haku Yesu a me ka uhane e mulele. Greetings from Hawaii. It's good again to address the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to Incomendios for providing this opportunity for this parallel event, this side event, so we can talk about this really, really pertinent topic in the Pacific at this point, and that is the demilitarization of the Pacific. And we're not talking about, well, we are talking about the entire Pacific, but we're talking about specific areas, and for ourselves, Hawaii, and for Okinawa, as well as for Guam. And now these three areas are particularly impacted, of course, by the United States military presence in our islands. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in Hawaii and how this entire militarization of these Pacific islands came about. So back in the late 19th century, the United States was looking westward past California and out into the Pacific and wanting very much to expand its influence out into the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Hawaiian Islands have been enjoying a 60-year trade relationship with the United States, and particularly the sugar industry had grown tremendously during the Civil War of the Americas. And in that, the Hawaiian Islands became the major sugar producer for the northern states of the United States. After the Civil War, so what happened with the sugar industry in Hawaii is that it boomed. There was a tremendous amount of growth and there's a tremendous amount of profits being made by growing more and more sugar. And that lasted for a few years after the Civil War. But once the southern states came back online with their sugar production, of course, the United States did not depend so much upon the Hawaiian Islands, and tariffs went into place, and unfavorable trade levels began to become discussed. And so the Hawaiian Islands, the people who owned the sugar plantations and ran the sugar business, which was by now a huge business in Hawaii, so they were very panicked about how they were going to be selling more sugar and how they could keep the market stable. So they plotted and they felt that the best way to do so was to have Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom, their country, annexed to the United States. That would solve their problem of having a stable sugar price for the sugar crops that they raised here in Hawaii. And so that was their motivation for pushing for annexation. And that started about 20 years prior to even the annexation happening. And all during this time, the monarch, King Kalakaua, and then later Queen Liliuokalani, were trying to hold the line and say, we do not want to be annexed to the United States, and that we are a sovereign country, and that we will make do. So this faction of sugar planters and businessmen, bankers, and the like, and shippers in Hawaii started to really plot against the government, to overthrow the government and to annex it to the United States. Now, this had been vetted with members of the United States, of the President of the United States, his cabinet members, particularly the War Department at the time. And what was going on was that the War Department of the United States, in looking to expand its influence into the Pacific, was eyeing Pearl Harbor as the ideal harbor for their Navy in the Pacific. And so there had been years of negotiations going on to have access to Pearl Harbor. So there were treaties, reciprocity treaties signed between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States to allow Pearl Harbor to be used by their Navy for a coaling station. It was not to be a military base, but a coaling station, meaning they could put up mountains of coal there and then refurbish the coal burning furnaces on their steamships, their Navy vessels. So it was a coaling station, but this was not quite enough for the United States. So they started to look toward how can we actually acquire exclusive use of Pearl Harbor for our use. So that's what happened. They started to come into collusion with the interests in Hawaii that wanted to join the United States through annexation, and the military industrial complex in the United States wanted to secure Pearl Harbor. So the two colluded, and they came up with this plot, which they finally executed on January 17th, 1893. And that's when the sugar planters and their chums got together they had formed what they call a committee of safety. And the committee of safety was to seize control of the Hawaiian Islands, seize control of the government, depose the Queen, and then enter into negotiations to annex Hawaii to the United States. And meanwhile, the United States would support this with the landing of a group of a company of Marines, about 160 of them, to ensure that the sugar planters could succeed in overthrowing the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So this plot hatched, and on January 16th, 1893, the Marines landed in Honolulu, bivouacked out in front of the palace, which was the seat of the government at the time. Well, the seat of government was in the government building, but the palace was where the home of the monarch was. So they basically pointed their guns, their cannons and their guns at the palace in this display of protection of the revolt that was going on, or the usurpation that was going on. And so the next day, on the 17th of January, 1893, the Committee of Safety declared themselves to be in charge of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, and ordered that the Queen step down. And the foreign ministry in Hawaii at the time of the United States, which is like the embassy of the United States, its representative, the ambassador, John L. Stevens, then backed the usurpers of the government, those that were creating a coup d'etat, and said that the United States now supported this fake government, or this insurgency. So the Queen actually, at that point, yielded to the United States, to the President of the United States, because she understood that this was a purely illegal act under international law, and that this could be settled through diplomacy and through international legal means. And so she was not worried about this being a permanent situation. She thought it was very temporary, and so she basically petitioned the United States to return her country. That didn't quite happen, and the insurgents sent a group to Washington, D.C., and within a week or so after their arrival, they had a treaty of annexation signed by the President of the United States, who at that time was Benjamin Harrison, and it was his administration that was behind this collusion of overthrowing the Hawaiian Kingdom. And anyway, he signed a treaty of annexation. It had to go to the U.S. Senate for ratification, and so it went there. But meanwhile, because Benjamin Harrison was a lame duck president, his presidency ended about a month and a half, 2 months after the insurgency, after the coup d'etat. So he had not gotten the Treaty of Annexation ratified by the Senate. And when the new president came in, Grover Cleveland was the new president. When he came in, he immediately withdrew the Treaty of Annexation from the Senate, and basically told them to hold off, and he conducted his own investigation. And the investigation goes on, and he uncovers the plot of what had happened, and basically disassociates the United States from what had happened, and said that the United States had actually committed an act of war against a friendly nation, and said that the United States was obligated to act in kind to return the proper government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, meaning the Hawaiian Kingdom government. So that's what happened. However, the United States military forces refused to actually withdraw or use that opportunity to wait until the president was out of office. And when the president left office in 1897, immediately another Treaty of Annexation ensued. And again, this was highly pushed, but this time it was being pushed by the new president of the United States, McKinley, and his cabinet and his staff, and particularly Theodore Roosevelt, who was his vice president, and other hawkish members who at that time were convinced that it was Hawaii's, the United States' manifest destiny to expand its influence into the Pacific. And so that's what they did. They cooked up a pretense under the cover of the Spanish-American War, in which they seized the Philippines, used Hawaii as the staging area for not only the Spanish-American War, which was fairly short-lived, it was just a few weeks long, but after that ensued a 4 or 5 year battle with the Filipinos, who thought that they were being liberated. But the United States then announced that they were indeed being colonized now by the United States. So the Filipinos took up arms, and they fought a battle that lasted about 5 years. Roughly 250,000, at least 250,000 Filipinos died in that war. and about 5,000 Americans died in that war. But that was the test. That was the pattern that was beginning to take place. Was the United States decided, and used Hawaii as the staging area for its reach into the Pacific, and that is where it all started, with the taking of the Hawaiian Islands and the establishment of military bases in the Hawaiian Islands. So after that, of course, there were a number of different wars in which the Hawaiian Islands were involved, mainly as a staging area. However, World War II, of course, Hawaii became a major target. And the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that day of infamy is very, very well remembered. But the thing that most people don't realize was that Japan was out to cripple the U.S. fleet that was harbored at Pearl Harbor, which is still where the U.S. fleet is harbored today, by the way. But the thing was a strategic move on the part of Japan to cripple American military forces in the Pacific, and that's what occurred at Pearl Harbor. So at this point, the Japanese attack was not against, of course, the Hawaiian Islands. It was against the military installations in the Hawaiian Islands, and that has been the case ever since. So Hawaii has been the main military outpost. It is the largest military command in the world. So, and that is headquartered in Honolulu. But what has happened over the years is that the Hawaiian Islands, or particularly Pearl Harbor and the military bases located on Oahu, are still the prime target for any enemy of the United States. So the benefit of having the United States military here is far reduced compared to the threat that it is to the people of the Hawaiian Islands. And we had an incident that happened in January 2018, I believe, in which there was a false alarm. There was a missile alert that went out to everyone's cell phone, which said that there was an incoming missile. And it was at the point where the words were being exchanged between North Korea and the United States, the belligerent words. And so it was a highly plausible attack from a nuclear attack from North Korea. That's what everyone assumed. And so everyone panicked. Now, it took about 40 minutes for the all clear signal to sound that there wasn't an attack. But in the meantime, what was exposed was that the United States has not made any preparation whatsoever to protect the civilian populations of Hawaii against a nuclear attack or against any kind of that attack. So we are in the midst of, or we are a big red X in the middle of the Pacific for any enemy of the United States to attack. Now, the level of warfare, of course, has increased tremendously from World War II, from December 7th, 1941, where that was a target. Japan sent in its fleet of bombers and specifically bombed the military targets. Today, one nuclear weapon detonated a couple of miles or a mile up above the island of Oahu would decimate the entire island and annihilate the entire population, whether they're civilian or military. And so this is the level of threat that we are facing today, much, much greater than what we faced in 1941 or even since. So this is why we're calling for the demilitarization of the Pacific. And it is a similar situation with Okinawa and with Guam. And we do not want to be wrapped up in this international global bullying on the part of big countries with big weapons, because we are at this point put at tremendous risk of not only our lives, but our existence, the existence of our nation. So the Hawaiian Kingdom is for calling the United States to withdraw completely from the Hawaiian Islands. And we want to do this in a peaceful manner, in a manner in which the United States can realize that they need to withdraw from foreign soil, our soil, and that it is our call to make. The Hawaiian Kingdom needs to make the call as to whether or not we want any kind of military, U.S. military or foreign military presence in our islands. So this is where we stand. We are calling upon the United States to return the Hawaiian Islands, or actually to back off and to, we are asserting our claim to the Hawaiian Islands to determine for ourselves the how we should be governed, as well as what policies we should have in the future in the area of international relations. So thank you very much for this time. I hope that you have been educated a little bit about our situation, and I would like to hear again from the other members of this panel. Mahalo nui, aloha.
Thank you, Minister Siu. You very clearly expressed the concerns in Hawaii. We appreciate you taking your time. Our next speaker is Mr. Robert Kajiwara. Mr. Kajiwara is a native Okinawan and the founder and president of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition. His petition to stop the construction of the military base at Henoko, Okinawa, has over 212,000 signatures. Mr. Kajiwara received his BA in history from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and is completing his Ph.D. in history from the Manchester Metropolitan University. Aloha, Mr. Kajiwara. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for tuning in today. We wish to remind the Council and the international community at large of the ongoing human rights violations being committed by Japan against the people of Luchu, also known as Okinawa, and I'll explain the difference in a moment. Please be advised that this video contains scenes of graphic violence and warfare that may be disturbing to some viewers. Since time immemorial, Luchu was a peaceful, prosperous, independent nation, maintained treaties with numerous other countries including the US, France, and the Netherlands, and maintained close friendly relations with China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Luchu was a center of international trade, finance, diplomacy, and cross-cultural exchange, with an expanded trade network so far-reaching that 4th century Roman coins with Emperor Constantine's bust on them have been found on Okinawa Island. Historic sources indicate that Luchu was one of the richest nations in Asia in terms of per capita wealth. European visitors were astonished by Luchu's prosperity and quality of life, writing that they searched the entire nation but could not find even a single poor or impoverished person. Both Europeans and Americans nostalgically compared Luchu to Italy due to its wealth, commerce, and beauty. They also referred to Luchu as the cleanest nation they had ever seen. Luchu had a particularly close, friendly, and mutually beneficial relationship with China. Although China and Luchu are close neighbors and share a border, in all of history there's not even one known instance of violence or warfare between the two countries. They have always respected each other's sovereignty and boundaries and worked together in multilateral ways. This was a very important and long-lasting relationship for both sides. In 1609, Japan invaded Luchu, similar to what it had done to China and Korea a decade earlier. Per the terms of the China-Luchu relationship, China was obligated to protect Luchu from foreign invasion. At the time, however, the Ming dynasty was in decline and experiencing many problems of its own, and was unable to help Luchu. From 1609 through 1879, Luchu was periodically forced to pay tribute to Japan. Unlike the special relationship between Luchu and China, the Luchu-Japan relationship has, since 1609, always been forced and one-sided.
This was, of course, a hindrance to Luchuans.
Nevertheless, the historical sources indicate very clearly that Luchu continued to be a prosperous, independent nation thanks to its robust trade and commerce, as well as its domestic agricultural, fishing, and environmental preservation policies. During the 19th century, Luchu was formally recognized by the Western powers as an independent country by signing treaties with other nations. In 1879, Japan again invaded Luchu, this time illegally annexing it against the will of Luchuans. Japan, of course, would go on to do the same to many other countries in Asia and the Pacific. Luchu requested China's help, but this time the Qing dynasty was in decline. Although China attempted to negotiate a settlement on Lu Chu's behalf, they were unable to save Lu Chu. Some Lu Chuans fled in exile to China, waiting and praying for the day that China would once again become strong enough to help drive out the Japanese invaders and restore Lu Chu's rightful independence. During this time, Japan changed the name of Lu Chu to Okinawa in an attempt to erase Lu Chu's history as an independent country, similar to what Japan did to many other countries. Japan inherited Lu Chu's treaties with other nations, which is a legal acknowledgement of Lu Chu's sovereignty that Lu Chu has never willingly given up. Thus, according to international law, Lu Chu is still a de jure independent country, meaning that Japan's current occupation of Lu Chu is illegal. During the 1940s, Japan intentionally built an inordinate amount of military presence on Okinawa Island with the deliberate intent to sacrifice Okinawans in order to save Japan. During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, around 150,000 to 200,000 Okinawans were killed, around 1/4 to 1/3 of the population. Japanese soldiers intentionally murdered thousands of Okinawan civilians, including women, children, and the elderly.
They especially targeted Lu Chuan leaders in an attempt to prevent Lu Chu from regaining its independence. They also targeted those they overheard speaking the native Okinawan language, which at the time was everyone.
Forced thousands others to commit suicide, used Okinawans as human shields, and forcibly conscripted Okinawans, including children, into the Imperial Japanese military. It is said that every Okinawan lost a loved one during this 3-month battle. Okinawans have never received compensation or an apology from Japan. To this day, Japan downplays and denies these atrocities the same way it denies its war crimes against China, Korea, and many other countries.
In comparison, the East Timor genocide, which occurred during the 1970s and lasted for a period of roughly 2 years, resulted in the deaths of around 100,000 people of East Timor, or around 1/6 of the population. If what happened in East Timor is considered genocide, then certainly what happened in Okinawa is also genocide. Yet the Japan government and people get very angry at Okinawans when we talk about this and send us harassing and threatening messages.
After the war, Lu Chu should have been included in the Trust Territories of the Pacific and had its independence restored. Instead, the United States military decided to keep Lu Chu for itself to use for bases. Okinawans are well known for our opposition to military bases, and thus in 1972, the U.S. gave Lu Chu to Japan without a vote from the Lu Chu people. This was an obvious illegal act because no country has the right to give another country to a third country.
So you can see that Japan has no legal claim at all to any part of the Lu Chu Islands. Japan's entire claim is based on imperialism and aggression. Today, Japan continues its oppression against Lu Chuans in an attempt to destroy the Lu Chu nationality, identity, culture, history, languages, and environment. Japan's actions against Lu Chu strongly fit the definition for genocide as set forth by the United Nations Office on the Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect, as well as the Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes.
Under the imperialist Japanese school system, Lu Chuan students are forced to learn Japanese history, culture, language, and identity, and Japan does not allow for the teaching of Lu Chuan equivalents. As a result, UNESCO has recognized all of the native Lu Chuan languages as endangered. Japan continues to build a heavy amount of military bases in Lu Chu while continuing its aggressive policies towards other countries. The Japan government recently declared that it is legal for it to launch a first strike missile attack against another country. In the event of another war started by Japan, Lu Chu will again be destroyed due to Japan's militarism and imperialism. Every day, Japan harasses, stalks, intimidates, and threatens Lu Chuans who peacefully resist Japan's oppression, including the illegal arrest and torture of Mr. Hiroji Yamashiro, the leader of Lu Chu's peace movement and a protected native citizen of Lu Chu.
In February 2019, the government of Japan even detained me for 110 minutes at Kansai International Airport while transiting from Honolulu to Tokyo on my way to give a series of presentations about Okinawa. I was released only after the personal intervention by the Okinawan Congressman Teruya Kantoku.
Shortly afterwards, Japan sent police to harass my family, friends, and neighbors in Okinawa. Japanese riot police regularly remove by force Luchuan peace advocates, most of whom are elderly. The government of Japan recently declared that it is legal for it to place GPS surveillance devices on private vehicles without the knowledge of its owners, meaning that Japan could monitor the movements of Luchuan leaders without our knowledge. In 1960, the Japanese socialist leader Inejiro Asanuma was assassinated on stage during a live televised event. There is serious concern that something similar could happen to Luchuan leaders and peace activists if the international community does nothing to assist. Although Luchu was historically a wealthy nation with virtually no poverty, since the illegal Japanese annexation, Luchuans have been poor and oppressed, causing some Luchuans to flee overseas as economic or political refugees. Today, Luchu has a 25% child poverty rate. Around 30% of Luchu's arable land is occupied by the military, yet the military contributes just 5% to the Luchuan economy, creating a huge economic deficit in addition to all of the environmental and social harm the military causes. The Japan government has claimed that the military bases are a resource to Okinawa, though the overwhelming majority of Okinawans oppose the bases. Japan is also purposely spreading false information about Okinawa, and Japanese people are even impersonating Okinawans online in an attempt to spread confusion and prevent Luchuans from obtaining international support.
Former Prime Minister of Japan, Yukio Hatoyama, even stated that people from within the Japan government created fake documents claiming they were from the U.S. military in order to justify the military bases on Okinawa. Professor Yuichi Hosoya, who formerly worked as part of the Shinzo Abe administration and is a professor of international politics at Keio University, recently stated in a report published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies that Okinawan independence groups and peace groups are receiving money from China. This is not true at all. We have not yet received any offers of assistance from China or any other country. Although if you are interested in working with us, please contact us. Japanese journalists also spread false information about Luchu. For example, in October 2019, the historic Shuri Castle, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Luchu Kingdom, tragically burned down. Shuri Castle is a unique Luchuan castle, which was home to the Luchu monarchy for hundreds of years, long before Japan's invasion. It is structurally very different from Japanese castles. Yet the Japanese journalist for the Associated Press wrote a headline referring to it as a Japanese castle. This was then syndicated and mimicked by numerous other publications around the world. So you can see Japan is misrepresenting Luchu in the media and erasing our history, culture, and identity. Both Japanese and American mainstream media leave out the voices of actual Luchuans when talking about Luchuan issues. Japan also appropriates Luchuan cultural properties such as karate, which was added to the Olympics for the 2020 or now 2021 Tokyo Games. Karate, also known in the indigenous Luchuan languages as Ti, is a unique Luchuan martial art developed by Luchuans over the course of hundreds of years. But the government of Japan refuses to allow a Luchuan karate team and instead forces Luchuans to compete on the Japan national team.
Although Luchuans are still the vast majority population of Luchu, Japan is purposely trying to displace Luchuans and to move Japanese settlers into the Luchu Islands. Japan even attempts to stop native Luchuans from returning home to Luchu.
Japanese settlers are also forcing native Luchuans to pay to use the beaches in Luchu in some areas.
The population of Luchu is around 1.4 million, with an additional 700,000 Luchuans living overseas. The population of Japan is around 120 million. Therefore, we really need international support in order to help protect our rights from Japan. Japan has ignored the UN's calls to improve its treatment of Luchuans. Though UNESCO recognizes Luchuans as an indigenous ethnic group and the Luchuan languages as endangered languages separate from Japanese, the government of Japan refuses to do so. In both 2010 and 2014, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination
indicated their concern regarding Japan's discrimination against Luchuans, which Japan completely ignored. In 2008 and 2014, the Human Rights Committee instructed Japan to provide guaranteed rights to Luchuans, which Japan also ignored. Thus, the international community must take stronger action towards Japan to ensure the rights of Luchuans. In December 2018, I started a petition to stop the illegal construction of the new military base at Hinoko, Okinawa, which is home to a coral reef filled with hundreds of rare and endangered species, such as the Okinawa dugong. The petition has over 212,000 signatures on it. Nevertheless, Japan has ignored my petition. In February 2019, Okinawa held a referendum in which over 72% of the people voted against this new base, while an additional 9% voted undecided. Japan has also completely ignored this. Luchu is Japan's last remaining colony, and they are using our islands to continue their imperialist, militaristic aggression. There will never be true peace or prosperity in the Asia-Pacific as long as Japan is allowed to continue its illegal occupation of Luchu. Prior to the 20th century, Luchu was a center of peace and prosperity, and it is critical for Luchu to resume that role in order for the region to stabilize and prosper. Therefore, we are requesting the assistance of the international community to help restore Luchu's rightful independence before it is too late. Luchuans have no interest in Japan's aggressive tendencies. We wish to once again make Luchu a prosperous, neutral, and demilitarized center of peace, trade, environmental conservation, and multilateral diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific region. If the international community ignores the plight of Luchu, it sets a very dangerous precedent for the world that international law is meaningless and that Japan or any other country could theoretically invade another country and not face any consequences. We are looking to work with other nations and NGOs worldwide in multilateral ways. If you are interested in working with us or would like to speak with us personally, please do not hesitate to email us at contact@peaceforokinawa.org. You can also learn more at our website, peaceforokinawa.org. I'm Robert Kajiwara. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you, Mr. Kajiwara, for your clarification regarding Japan's human rights violations on the Okinawan people. Our next speaker is the Honorable Sheila Babauta. Congresswoman Babauta is a daughter of the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, also called CNMI, and is passionate about contributing to a brighter future for her islands. After graduating from the CNMI public school system, she acquired her associate's degree at Kapi'olani Community College in Honolulu and her BA in Finance and International Business from the University of Hawaii, Manoa. At the age of 29, Congresswoman Babauta gained the trust and confidence of her community in Precinct 4 and began serving as a member in the 21st CNMI House of Representatives. Her longstanding commitment to service is evident through her involvement in various nonprofit organizations and initiatives focused on youth education and empowerment, sustainable business development, and environmental conservation and protection. Congresswoman Babauta, the floor is yours.
Hafa from the beautiful Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, where our waters are blue and welcoming, where our skies are clear, and where our families really enjoy a peaceful way of life. We are often considered a very small place on the map, and usually reminded about our strategic location and value to the military. But we are much more than that. We are a people full of history, a rich culture, and we have so much value and so much to offer the world. We are highly interconnected, and the recent movement of troops from Okinawa to Guam will heavily impact the Northern Mariana Islands. The Department of Defense has plans to train these troops using highly destructive forms of artillery, bombs, rockets, sonar testing, the introduction of new weaponry systems, aircrafts, and vessels. This is a major concern for myself and many members in our community. My name is Sheila Babauta, and I am a member of the 21st CNMI House of Representatives. I am a daughter of the Marianas. I am a member of our Commonwealth 670, and I am a protector of our homeland. This is our home, and the military's plans really threaten the sustainability of our lands and our waters. It threatens the health and well-being of our people, and it really threatens what we have to leave for our children. What will our children inherit? What will they be left with? They are always at the forefront of the decisions we must make when they impact our future. Our children deserve a place to raise their families in a safe and healthy environment, and the military's presence really threatens that. Our oceans are home to many marine mammals, sea turtles, dolphins, and whales. Our lands are home to birds and beautiful wildlife that are threatened by the military's proposed plans of destructive behavior. With the recent record of decision that was released, choosing Alternative 2 as the preferred alternative for the Department of the Navy, it is the most highly destructive alternative for our land. And this has really brought so much concern to our community. We want to protect our homeland. We want to protect what limited resources we have for our children. And we want to protect the sustainability for our future of the CNMI. We thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to share our story and introduce ourselves on this platform. We hope that this testimonies today about the military's presence in the Pacific will spark some form of action. We are indigenous peoples in the Pacific Ocean, the Chamorros and Carolinians, who have enjoyed these lands and waters for thousands of years. And we deserve a future with our children and for our children in a place that is healthy and safe and beautiful.
With the relocation of troops from Okinawa to Guam, there is major impact to come for the Mariana Islands, and it is very serious. Although we are a very patriotic community with one of the highest per capita of enlisted servicemen and women, we have died and fought in U.S. wars. We also value our culture, our community, and our natural resources. But we feel like we're at the table with Goliath. How does one prepare to negotiate and encourage Goliath to come to the table where we can foster cooperation and coexistence to support national security while preserving our culture and conserving our natural resources?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. You know, it's a great question. You know, since I'm no longer commander-in-chief, I can't just say, "Come on, let's go talk." And I'm now out of date in terms of all the processes and procedures that are taking place. What I think is true, and this is not unique to the United States, I think this is true for a lot of countries that have a large military infrastructure, is that the military often is not as mindful as it needs to be about its impacts on the surrounding community. Look, in Hawaii, you know, we still have a whole set of issues around the military presence and training, and how does that affect surrounding communities. A general rule when dealing with organizations or institutions that are bigger and more powerful than you is you've got to bring attention to the issue so that you get allies, right? I think the average person in the United States is not aware of some of the impacts that base relocations may have on local communities. So one of your first jobs is to raise awareness. And hopefully some of the tools that you've been learning in these workshops have taught you how to do that. If not, then we'll get some stuff online. But the power of the underdog in society, first and foremost, is to be able to mobilize public opinion. Since you don't have the ability to just impose your will on someone, you have to get allies, right? I mean, that's what happened in the civil rights movement. You had TV cameras showing people with dogs and fire hoses directed at peaceful marchers, which started changing attitudes, which in turn led the federal government to start taking different steps. I think as you are raising awareness, I think it's important also, and I assume that some of this has been covered in some of our workshops. If not, we got to get it online. You have to know what it is that you want.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your vision for your islands and for planting the seeds today for the positive changes needed in the future. This concludes our panel discussion on demilitarizing the Pacific. We wish to thank Encomendios for sponsoring this event, as well as co-sponsors Koani Foundation in Hawaii and the Peace for Okinawa Coalition. Mahalo to His Excellency Leon Siu for discussing the issues relative to Hawaii, to Mr. Robert Kajiwara for sharing his concerns on Okinawa, and to Congresswoman Sheila Babauta for conversing about the military situation in the Northern Marianas Islands. If you'd like to get in touch with any of the speakers, please contact them at foreignaffairs@hawaiiankingdom.net or contact@peaceforokinawa.org. You can also learn a little bit more about this subject on the websites hawaiiankingdom.net and peaceforokinawa.org. I'm Lyla Berg, moderator for today's panel. Thank you for joining us, and aloha. See you soon.